Okay. Just give you guys a minute to come in here while I prep. As you can see, I have a very okay. All right. So, Victoria, please let me know if you can hear. Now I'm gone. Oh wow. You can't hear me? Okay. What is going on? Okay. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Okay. How about the music? Can we hear the music? Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, let me fade out. All right, first things first. I wanted to just give a couple of shout outs. There's been a lot of support coming in the last few days. Let me just say a few words and then get started with today, because today's discussion is going to be quite elaborate, so I don't want to miss anything out. I've prepped. I have my slides as always. I said as always. Since last week, I started doing slides. But I'm really enjoying this, guys, so far. So thank you. Let me just get my shout outs. So a couple of people have been super supportive over the last this last week. Big donations. Thank you to, oh God, what's his name now? Thank you to Chief Olatunji Aresha, I think is how you say it. Thank you very much for the support, brother. I really appreciate it. Also wanted to give a special shout out to a couple of other people. Kimuyu LLC, nice $50 donation. Stephanie Thornton, thank you so much. A few more people who I'll shout out later on. But for the sake of time, let me just get started. So good evening to everybody. People a bit slow today. I figured it's a Sunday night. You know, let me do this a little bit later, but you know, there's no time like the present. Me, I love doing this sort of stuff. So I'm appreciative if there's even one person that's joining in. All right, so let me get started. Oh, Victoria, thank you so much, sister. Thank you. That's you. Okay. All right, let me get started. Okay, where are we? How do we do this now? Okay. So, Islam and the Arab slave trade. A couple of things I need to, let me go back to me. A couple of things I need to just talk about quickly. We have, especially this week, there's been a lot of stupidity regarding this whole woman king conversation. There's some people that don't quite get the message, and I understand that there's a lack of information. There's a lack of information regarding this sort of thing, but this is what we're trying to correct. I think some people would rather just stay in a somewhat ignorant state instead of trying to really understand. I think the Woman King film has done a lot of things. Primarily, it's I think it's forcing these conversations. I was on Courtney Hawkins. Is it Courtney Hawkins? Courtney. I was on her show earlier this week, and the point was that we were trying to mend fences between Africans in Africa and Africans in the diaspora, to try and understand that we are all complicit, we are all part and parcel of this enslavement thing. Okay, and we're all responsible for fixing it as well. But that said, Galactic Soul, shout out to you, Victoria. Thank you. And I'm sure people will come in as time goes by. So let me just get started. So I just wanted to say that today I'm going to be dealing with the Arab slave trade, because Arab slave trade and Islam in particular are significant if you even want to understand the concept of slavery. With Dahomey Kingdom, with West Africa, and the so-called transatlantic slave trade, the issue with that one has always been that it was Africans selling Africans, blah blah blah. But there was a complex structure that we tried to explain in the last week's session, but also that I explained in my documentary, Dahomey, the Dahomey Kingdom. It's a complex structure involving middlemen in Africa, middlemen in Europe, but mostly it's a deal between Africans on the continent and European traders who have land in the Americas, who create the demand and then force the Africans through trade of weapons and so on to their neighbors to provide the supply. So these things end up becoming very complicated, but then we always want to try and just stick the blame on one person. Now, when it comes to the Arab slave trade, it's less complex because Islam is the unifying factor. It's the thing that keeps the system working perfectly. The Arab slave trade happens, nearly 1,000. No, I'm exaggerating. Nearly 800 years before. It's about 800 years before the so-called transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, it happened before in smaller sections, but when we talk about the period that will lead up to this so-called transatlantic slave trade, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So let me just try and go through details. Please bear with me. I'm going to need you to really try and understand some of these concepts before we move on. So I'm going to try and establish them now. Okay, so here's my slide. This is from the film Lawrence of Arabia, by the way, one of my favorite films. Directed by David Lean, starring Peter O'Toole. All right, now here's a quote that I just wanted to quote. It sounds really pretentious here, but anyway, you get the point. What I'm trying to say is to study the history of a region over a specific time, we cannot be restricted to that region nor that time, especially when the people were nomadic. Okay, what I mean by this, quite simply, is if you want to study the history of the United States of America, you don't just study what happens within the borders of the United States of America. You study what happened in Mexico. You study what happened in Hawaii. You study what happened in France, in Spain, in Britain, because all these things have an impact on what eventually creates the United States of America. So we're not restricting ourselves to one single place and one single time. We have to go to a different place also. Okay, so that's what this quote is all about. Okay, it's very, very important that we understand this. So before I go on, here are some useful books. I don't like to be one of those people who just makes up my own history. There might be some things that I won't have time to give you an exact quote, simply because this topic is quite long and quite elaborate. So these are some books that I think will be useful to you that will discuss various aspects of what I'm going to talk about this evening. So Travels Through Syria, which is a book about essentially the Middle East, I suppose. Civilization or Barbarism by Sheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese writer. Black Athena by Martin Bonnell. Black Athena, actually, let me just show you what they look like, just so you know. So Black Athena, this book over here, is very useful if you're trying to understand the African. It's written by Martin Bonnell. He's from Cornell University. I think he wrote it about 30-something years ago. If you want to understand the Minoan Crete civilization, how African people essentially created the Cretan and Roman and Greek civilizations, excuse me. This is a very good book to understand. He's not a black man, by the way, just so you know. The other book, Civilization or Barbarism, I'm going to be quoting from today, just one or two quotes that I'm going to use at some point, just so you can understand some of the things. Okay, so this book is very good. Civilization or Barbarism. My God, I left some books out. Okay. And then, of course, the Quran. Quran, I will quote, I might paraphrase. Okay, and then also Herodotus. Herodotus is the Greek writer who traveled to Egypt and traveled around different parts of Africa, and actually was one of the few that made first contact, or at least was first made aware about the Africans sub-Sahara, below the Sahara. He didn't make contact with them, but he wrote about them. Okay, so let me get back to my presentation. So it's important that you understand where we are. The last couple of weeks, whenever I've been trying to explain things, it's been difficult because there's no map. You guys don't really know where I am. So I don't know if you guys can see this. So this is the map of what is called what you would call North Africa and the Middle East. Okay. So when we're talking about North Africa and the Middle East, you have to see that they are directly connected, always have been through history. Okay. I think Islam, unlike other things, was seen as a primary identifier in these regions, not necessarily because there was no racial separation, but mainly because it was the primary identifier. Can you guys hear me? I hope you can hear me. I don't know what I'm doing with this thing. Anyway, I apologize, guys. I'm still trying to figure out this whole sound thing. But the primary identifier for in Islam is the religion itself. But I think it's also important to understand Islam, or rather Africa's role in the Abrahamic religions. Before we go and talk about Islam, you have the three Abrahamic religions effectively. The first one being Judaism, not necessarily because it was written first, but Judaism is the precursor, first few books of the Old Testament. In Judaism, we first hear about Africa when we talk about the Passover, the period of the Passover, the period where Moses leads his people out of Egypt and into Canaan. Okay, so this is the first time we start to hear about Judaism. I mean, Africa. Sorry. Now, in Christianity, the first time we really start to hear about it in Christianity, even though we kind of hear it in the Abraham story, is when we start talking about Jesus fleeing Egypt. Jesus fled Egypt, of course, because Herod was trying to kill all the young boys of a certain age. Let me turn this music down. Trying to kill all the young boys of a certain age in order to stop this Messiah from being born. Right? So this is in Christianity. So we start to see that it's coming in Christianity. Africa is showing up in Christianity. Now in Islam, it comes up with what they call the Al-Hijra al-Awwal, which is basically the period where in order to flee persecution in Makkah and Medina, Muhammad and his supporters moved to Muhammad is told to go to Ethiopia, where there is a Christian king, the Negus. And effectively, that is the first migration out of so-called Middle East. Okay, so let me just go back to that map. That is the first migration out of this particular region. Okay, so we're leaving this region. If you look to the right, where you see Jordan, Saudi Arabia, that is the Arabian Peninsula. So we start to see that beginning to change. Now, it's also important to understand there is a connection between this part of the world and Africa. Okay, the connection between the Arabian Peninsula and Africa is so important. There's a linguistic connection, by the way. I don't know if any of you travel, if you go to places like Oman or Bahrain, especially in Oman, there's a Swahili contingent. Okay, these are more recent migrants that have come to that part of the world. But when I say recent, I mean in the last 200 or 300 years. There's obviously a linguistic connection because of the sheer proximity between Northeast Africa and then the so-called Middle East and then the Arabian Peninsula. And this is long before any kind of Islam or Christianity. Okay, so you have the people like, let me just show you the map again. You have the people of Ethiopia, Somalia, that part of the world are directly connected there. These are the Semitic people. This is where we get the word Semitic. So even when you start talking about Semites, we're not necessarily talking about white Hasidic Jews. We're talking about people from this part of the world, Northeastern Africa and the so-called Middle East. So these people, these Afro-Semitic people, these are the Amhara, Tigrinya, these languages that you would hear in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, those kind of countries. These people, their language is actually a Semitic language. In fact, they even say that the language group is called Afro-Asiatic, which if you go all the way to West Africa, the Fulani, Fulfulde or Pul, whichever word you use, but the Fulani in particular is the most common word. The Fulani language is actually an offshoot of Afro-Semitic. So you could say that the Fulanis, or what you can also call the Tuaregs, these are the nomadic people of West Africa, are also part of that group. So these ties were obviously there for language, but also through trade and commerce. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about what Arabia was like. What was Arabia at the time? Okay. Let me go back. Oops. I hope you guys can hear me. Kwame Olatunji, shout out to you. Michael Daniels, thank you very much for coming in, my people. Okay. So let me just go over that. So what is Arabia at this point in time? Okay. Now, clearly, there is if you take out the Suez Canal, which is the strip of water that was created in the late 1800s in order to separate Middle East and Africa, if you take that out, Africans essentially go into Arabia and Arabians go into Africa, literally by walking. Okay. So these are effectively nomadic people. Once you take the Egyptian Empire out, these are the nomadic people that live in that northern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Obviously, there was some division there between the Asiatics, the people that came from the Asia part. Okay. And you have to, let me show you the map so that you see that this is really in close proximity. Where you see Iraq there, that's the border that takes you into Asia, if you want to call it that. And then, of course, you also have the African part, or the Semitic part. So by the time of Muhammad, okay, and Ibn Battuta talks about this. By the time of Muhammad, it was only about 10% black. Okay, only 10% of the people were African people, black people. The rest were mixed by various groups and created a sort of mulatto race at that point. But prior to that, centuries before that, it was essentially a black place, just like most places in the world. Remember, African people are the first to populate the world as in all forms of humanity, but specifically as Homo sapiens sapiens. That is the upright human beings with the brains that we have. So the last stage of humanity is civilized in Africa and then leaves. So every single stage of Africans have left Africa and gone to different parts of the world. The ones that remain are us, and we started as African even in the Arabian Peninsula and China, as far as China, Japan, and so on. Okay, so we're talking about people who started off black, and by the time of Muhammad, and we're now talking about the 7th century. Muhammad is the 7th century, the 600s. At this point in time, we are only about 10% in that region. Okay, and this is according to Ibn Battuta. Various groups will have it at like 15, 10%. So it just depends. All right, so let me just go back to this image so that you can see. So I want you to get that image in your head, okay? So the Arabian Peninsula essentially is a place where I guess Muhammad and his followers were born. If you know the story of the Prophet Muhammad, Angel Gabriel appeared to him, taught Muhammad around 622, gave him some type of message from God, which was supposed to unite the Arabs and so on. Now, at the time, obviously, there are two types of Arabia. During the time of Muhammad, there's like a kind of a light-skinned one and a dark-skinned one. Okay. In fact, Bilal, and I want to make sure this part is clear. Bilal, who is the person who creates the Adnan, right? The Azan, the call to prayer, the song. That song is by a man called Bilal. Bilal is depicted even till today as an African person, a dark-skinned black man. Okay. This isn't. But then, of course, there's some accounts that say, oh, he was a slave. He wasn't a slave. He was actually a diplomat who came over. Okay, so even the call to prayer that we have in Islam, or that people have in Islam, is one that is created by a black man. That voice, that Allah Akbar, that is created by a black man. Okay, so it's a very important fact. So all this is going on, and then I guess the fair-skinned types, they run Muhammad out of Arabia, and he eventually goes to Ethiopia. And then, of course, there is some sort of spread. There's no initial spread because the king in Ethiopia is a Christian king. Okay, so that's that. Okay, let me just move on to the next slide so that there's no confusion. All right, so this is just sort of like a timeline, just so you guys can see the leadership in Islam. So around 632, Muhammad the Prophet, he dies. And there is a power struggle for who's going to take, not a power struggle. Initially, there's no power struggle, but a man called Abu Bakr, his right hand. And just so you know, even before Abu Bakr takes over, Bilal, this black man creates this song, was one of the people that was offered the position of being the head of Islam, essentially the caliph, the head of Islam. Now, the head of Islam is not just like saying, oh, I'm pastor of a church, or, you know, I'm a bishop in a church or whatever. It is essentially like a kingdom. Okay. And this is where we have to start understanding. It is a kingdom for the most part. And what it became even after that was an empire. Okay. So Bilal eventually turns it down, and then, turns it down, refuses, whatever the case may be. And then Abu Bakr takes over. Abu Bakr takes over for a couple of years. Then Abu Bakr steps down. So he's there for about 2 years. Then he steps down. And then Umar the Great is there for about 10 years. Umar the Great is then assassinated. And then another man called Uthman ibn Affan takes over. Okay. And he's also later assassinated. So you already see the kind of power struggles that are going on as a result. So now they have to invade Egypt, and you have to understand the importance of them invading Egypt in understanding how, first of all, the slave trade even starts, but also how Islam comes into Africa. Okay. Islam, like Christianity, has its roots in Africa. But when I say roots, I mean the bare roots. The religion itself is none of those religions are actually created in Africa per se, with the exception of Christianity. But it's in this case of Christianity, it gets exported to Constantinople. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But the point is, they have to invade Egypt, the country directly to the west of them. Okay, so if I go back to my map, they go and invade Egypt. Egypt is just that close to them. Okay. Now, what was Egypt like at the time? At the time, Egypt was this image actually I took from the book Civilization or Barbarism by Sheikh Anta Diop. This is an image of the Sphinx. Now, we all know the Sphinx to be something that is we all know the Sphinx to be like I guess there's no nose. It's this ambiguous image of some person. But the reality is, people, when the Arabs came in, and certainly even when the Europeans came in later in the 1700s, they saw that this thing was actually, had a nose. And this is the image I was trying to show. So this is a sketch that Sheikh Anta Diop was able to find. Okay, so Egypt itself was not the Egypt, obviously, of the pharaohs, and I think we need to make that clear. That time had gone long time. So you had the Assyrians had come in, and they were able to do it because they had superior weapons. Okay, they were using the iron. They were using iron for fighting, for swords, when we weren't using it for swords. Okay, and that's how we were defeated. Then you have Alexander the Greek. He came in 332 BC, and by 325 BC, you have the Ptolemy the First Lagi. This is where we first start to see that image that eventually this is the first image that we start to see that becomes eventually the first image that we see of Jesus. Okay, now I won't go into any more detail than that. I don't want to confuse anybody. But at this point in time, it is Greek. 332 BC, it's Greek. Then, and let me show you, you have Alexander the Greek, and then you have the Seleucids, which is basically the Syrian people, who essentially, they were basically two different kingdoms of Egypt. Okay, one run by Syrians and one run by the Greeks. Okay, and then of course by 31 BC you have the Romans, and let's just be clear: the Roman invasion was twofold. For one, the Romans eventually came in. The story of Cleopatra. Cleopatra is effectively lured into the bed of Julius Caesar, and this is the Ptolemaic time. So this is why there's always this conversation about is she black, is she white? She wasn't fully black, that's for sure. So it's understandable that but she certainly wasn't a white woman. Okay, so Cleopatra is there almost as a mediator between her kingdom and the Romans. But when the Romans take over, they really start to really exert themselves as superior soldiers and so on. Okay. All right. So let me move on. I'm doing these notes, guys, because sometimes I can waffle and I don't want to miss anything out, and I don't want to be historically inaccurate. Okay. So these are just some notes that I did earlier today, and I want you guys to see. So this is the Roman Empire. This is what the Roman Empire looks like, okay? And I think even before we get to that, let me just explain to you how important how important Egypt is to Christianity, because the Romans eventually become Christian. That's for another topic entirely. But the founding fathers of what became Christianity, when Christianity eventually went to the Byzantine Roman Empire in Constantinople, now Istanbul. So a lot of the founding fathers were Egyptian. Even the concept of the Trinity was put forward by an Egyptian. That's the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Father, Son, Mother, really. And then also another good book you can actually read is Historical Origin of Christianity by Walter Williams. That's a good book to understand how, like, literally the chronology of Christianity and how it starts in Africa and how it builds, goes into Rome and forms this this like association with Catholicism and then eventually Protestantism, because Christianity starts out as Catholicism. Make no mistake, there's nothing else. It's Catholicism first. But it starts in Istanbul and then moves to Rome in Italy now. All right, so Rome. What was Rome like? What was Rome and Egypt like? So basically, if you know the story of Attila the Hun, he eventually like caused the demise of the Roman Empire. He invaded, and then at this point, it became the sort of Holy Roman Empire. So Constantinople, Istanbul, was the major like stronghold of the what was left of the Roman Empire. So basically what had happened is that Roman Empire had come back into Egypt, and they were helped along by the conniving Coptics, which are the people that were left in Egypt, the traditional people that were left in Egypt, who eventually converted to Christianity, but helped facilitate the Roman invasion. They were essentially Uncle Toms, okay, for lack of a better word, okay. Now let me move on because I don't want to waffle too much. We've already gone a lot longer than I needed to. I might have to do this one in 2 episodes because there's a lot to get through, and I really want you guys to understand the basis of it, okay. So we're still talking about, let me just summarize for those people who came in. We're talking about the Arabian Peninsula. After the Prophet Muhammad dies, there is a sort of power struggle, and all the subsequent leaders after him decide to come and invade Egypt and spread the word through conquest. So before I even go any further, understand that North Africa is conquered through conquest. It becomes Islamic through conquest. And that's what opens up the gates of trade south. So we have no slave trade, We have no slave trade if there is no system that's been put in place by the Arabs. Because up until then, no one was really going into that part of the world, okay, to do any sort of major trade. Because of the Sahara Desert, it's not an easy place. It's not an easy place today, let alone 2,000 years ago. All right, so here's the next slide. So they came into Egypt. Please let me know if you're seeing these slides, guys. I want to just make sure you can actually see them, okay? I hope they're not. I hope it's clear. All right, so they come into Egypt, and they don't just stop in Egypt, but they never go beyond the first cataract. In other words, they never go beyond Luxor. If any of you been to Egypt before or know where Egypt is, you got Cairo right on up there, Alexandria right on the Mediterranean. Then you have Cairo, and then below that, about 600 miles or so, 600 kilometers or so, you have Luxor. Luxor is really where you have the Valley of the Kings. You have Hatshepsut's temple. Like, all the beautiful stuff is in what they call Upper Egypt. So these guys were never really able to go beyond the first cataract, which is, they stayed in Lower Egypt, which is the north. Lower because in terms of hills and everything, it was on lower ground. So they were never able to go beyond the first cataract. Okay, so that's a big important thing, because there was significant forces that were stopping them, particularly a nation called Makuria, which is part of what they called Christian Nubia. Christian Nubia is very significant. Remember, I told you the Romans had come, but there was also a Christian king in Ethiopia, but Nubia itself was Christian. Okay, Nubia, what is now southern part of Egypt or Upper Egypt, and then the northern part of Sudan, and even actually most of Sudan today. This is why you have that issue that happened in Sudan, by the way. All right, so but the Muslims, they never go that far south. They do go across, and they go into places that like Tripoli, places like Tunisia, Algeria, and all these various places. And that's just so you could see the kind of places that they were eventually able to conquer. We're not going to deal with Spain, Portugal, and France, but it's important to understand when you talk about the Moors going into that part of the world, going into Spain and into Europe. They were part of this same invasion of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula into North Africa, over the Mediterranean, and into Spain, Portugal, and southern France. Okay, so we're talking about something that's really significant. So they go and invade all these different places at different times, and they create this sort of like expansion. Now, the only group that gives them a little bit of trouble are the Berbers, which is a group that exists around Morocco area. Okay, and rather than, maybe I won't go into too much detail about the Berbers, but the Berbers are also pretty significant because when people talk about Berbers, it makes it seem like there's just one group called the Berbers. Like everything, especially in Africa, they're very different. There are various different groups. So you have like the Sanhaja Berbers, who are pretty significant to this story, actually. You have the Godala, you have the Mesufa. These are different like Berber groups. So ethnically, they're sort of a mixture too, but culturally, they seem a lot more African. In fact, if you see the way their music and so on, the way they do it. So in fact, even when you talk about Umar Gaddafi, who just passed away, who claims he's an Arab, he's not much Arab left. There's a lot of Berber in him, and then eventually the Turks came in. So he's got a lot of mixture in him. So, but Berbers are essentially the people that occupy that part of northwest Africa. Okay, so now some of them were Christian also, some were Jews, but mostly they were indigenous. And in fact, if you read Ibn Khaldun is an Islamic writer, traveler, philosopher. He wrote about them. He even says that they apostated 3 times. Apostated essentially means that they gave up on Islam 3 times when they were invaded. Like, in other words, you're invaded, you have to become a Muslim. 3 times they decided not to be. They pushed it away because there was something very powerful about their culture, which is very significant when you talk about what happened later in West Africa. Okay, so Arabians are different in terms of, because essentially they're colonizing, but they're not doing it like the way the British did later and so on. They are doing it by them intermarrying, okay? And they do this right along the way. Romans also intermarried, okay? So it just shows you how the world was. There was a certain level of racism, but it wasn't overwhelming racism. Like, they would at least be able to marry the women, marry into the families. And after 2 or 3 generations, you'll quickly see that Arabic becomes the main language spoken. Islam becomes the main religion. So like 2-3 generations in, the nobility is all essentially Arab, right? And then the Berbers start to take Arab names and so on. In the same way that, if you go to my country, 100 years ago, nobody had an English name. No, maybe 150 years ago, nobody had an English name. But now everybody has an English name first, or something. Not everybody, but you know what I mean. Because it's the missionary schools made it compulsory to accept this as part of the culture. So they're not saying don't have an African name. They're just saying use your English name, okay, or Christian name. So there's an Arabization or Islamization of Northern Africa, okay? And of course, like I said, it took several generations. And of course, there's also an importance here, because if you look at this map, we're talking about the Mediterranean Sea. Who has access to the Mediterranean Sea? Now, it's so important to understand that the Mediterranean Sea is the gateway for travel and trade. This is not a very good picture, by the way. Let me see if I can find a better one. Let me see. Yeah, so maybe this is a little bit better. So the Mediterranean Sea, as you can see, this is basically showing what it was like during the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire. And then you could see that connects you from Northern Africa, the Middle East, even parts of Asia, into Europe. Okay, so this is a time when you have, for any of you who know anything about the Silk Road, silk, bringing silk from China, bringing spices from India. The Mediterranean Sea was the part of the world that controlled this, okay? So whoever had access to it was essentially in a good place. Now, here's where the slavery conversation starts, the first part of the slavery conversation, and I'll probably do the second part of it another day. Okay, so like I said, the Egyptians, sorry, the Islamic movement or the Arab movement, they're both interchangeable. When they come into Egypt, they're never able to go beyond the first cataract. Okay, in other words, never able to go as far as, say, Luxor, okay, or stop at Luxor, because they're in Christian Nubia. You have two powerful kingdoms. The one I want to deal with is the kingdom of Makuria. And by the way, I was trying to. The thing is, these maps that you find on Google, the images are just not the best. So please bear with me. I'm trying to give you guys an overall picture. Kingdom of Makuria. So they invade there a couple of times. First time is 642 AD. So keep in mind, Prophet Muhammad has only been dead about 10 years now. Okay, he's only been dead about 10 years. But these guys have been able to conquer Egypt and are now going to try and conquer Makuria. So if you look on the map that I've got up there, Makuria is essentially, if you follow the Nile River, and you have to also understand the importance of rivers when you talk about civilizations. The Nile River is so significant in understanding, if you want to understand the kingdoms that existed along that time. Everything happens along the Nile River. In fact, when the Arabs come and build and replace, there's a place called Fostat. They renamed that Cairo. And when they go across North Africa, they create Tunis, they create Algiers, they create Marrakesh, all these places which are on the Mediterranean, essentially, or along a river, because of the significance of trade, bringing products from the south, bringing products in from Europe, and so on. Okay, so back to the image. Okay, so 642, they tried to invade our people. Okay, they tried to invade our people, and unfortunately, rather than initially, rather than, if you read the first battle of Dongola is the capital of Makuria. Okay, this is in what is now called Sudan today. They first tried to invade, and rather than face them, the Makurians moved back. Okay, so they didn't want to engage. Then they eventually fought a battle, and we beat the Egyptians. I mean, we beat the Islamic army. This is so important because you know when we study history, they never really talk about like significant defeats. Remember, this Islamic jihad, if you will, is going across North Africa pretty much unblemished and not losing battles. But they go to Africa, they go to the southern, close to sub-Saharan Africa, they go south of Egypt, and they start suffering. Okay, so it's not till like 10 years later that they regroup, and then they come back. Right now, when they come back, it's not as straightforward as the previous time. In fact, it's even harder because the Nubians had these things called phalanxes, basically bowmen, bow and arrow guys, and they were supreme. Okay, this is something which we need to start talking about a little bit more, like just how the amount of times Africans defeated Europeans or invaders. It happened also in ancient Egypt, but of course the most recent one, as we always talk about, is in Haiti, but also recently actually in Somalia during the Black Hawk Down, that whole thing. But Africans defeat Europeans quite often in history, but in this particular time it was significant. It was so bad that the Arabs, or the Islamic empire, decided, let's go sue for peace. And they came up with this, there was this thing called the Baqt. Let me show you the spelling, Baqt, right? B-A-Q-T, which basically is like, I think it's Latin or Greek for like the word pact. Basically, it's a treaty. Now, with this treaty, they were basically saying that we're going to, for 700 years, we're not going to invade you. You know, you guys can come into our area. We can come into your area. Nobody will be attacked. But in replace for that, we have to collect something from you. So we'll give you wheat, we'll give you barley and all these things, but you have to give us 360 Africans. Okay, this is the first sanctioning of slavery. 360 Africans plus 40 of the best. Like, and it's like the best. They want no old people and no children. They want the most prime people. And then they wanted 40 for the, what was the viceroy? The, like, I guess the mayor of Cairo, or Egypt rather, the like governor of Egypt. Now, this obviously creates a problem for the rest of us, because we would just easily say, okay, slavery. Oh, we've sold our people into slavery. But if you understand the concept of what is happening, these people can invade, but keep losing. But rather than have any sort of continuous war, they say, look, give us Africans. So again, they've created another demand. They could have said, give us your phalanxes, your bow and arrow men, come and train our own. They could have said anything, but they asked for human beings. Now, of course, slavery in those days sometimes wasn't, for the most part, wasn't in perpetuity. In other words, you were not a slave. Your children's children were not supposed to be slaves. The idea is take somebody, they become a slave, and they eventually can even become part of the family. So they're not like, it's not the same system. Okay, so we're talking about a different thing. Now, let me move on because I'm taking too long. I'm taking way too long. Okay, so they eventually do this deal, 360 plus 40. So essentially 40 slaves a year. 400 slaves a year in exchange for wheat, barley, wine, and so on. But so the damage is already done. The damage is already done. We've already sanctioned slavery against our people. We've sanctioned it. We've already said, look, it's happening. Okay. It's not the only time. Of course, again, there was a Christian slave trade. In fact, the word slave comes from the word Slav. If you know anything about the Slavic people of Eastern Europe, they were perpetual slaves of people in that part of the world. Maybe not perpetual slaves, but they were slaves of those people. And that's where the English word slave comes from. So we're actually taking the word of people who were enslaved. And later on, if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about the Slavic people. And just so you know why they had the word, why we took their name to call enslaved people in the world in the English language. All right, so where was that? Okay, so, all right, so this deal is done, this Baqt, and it means that we have now sanctioned slavery, essentially. And it's very unfortunate, but it is what it is. But it's also important to note that it was not for like nearly 1,000 years that these people were able to penetrate what was then called Christian Nubia, and later became just part of Sudan. All right, so let me move on. I think I'm going to stop in a couple of slides just because I don't want to spend too long. So where are we? Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So here we are. And by the way, I can't. I've not been shouting everybody out, but Lizzie, Arthur Hollingsworth, Kwame Olatunji, B. Akpodiete. Nice to see all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is probably going to be in 2 parts. Okay, so you might want to, I don't want to overdo you with the information, but it's very important because this Arab slave trade, the so-called slave trade as it begins in Africa, is so significant if you understand Islam and how Islam spread. Okay. And I think there's also a positive story to be told here, despite the fact that it led to many millions being taken away. But let me get back to my point. So you have this Arabization, Islamization of Northern Africa. Okay. They're now starting to think, okay, we need to control the Mediterranean. And I think essentially 2 types of Arabs. There's a Northern Arab and then there's a Southern Arab. I'll deal with a little bit later on. But there's a Southern Arab who is close to the Red Sea, who has, I showed you, is in close proximity to Somalia and all these other countries, but also to the Indian Ocean and the Swahili coast, so Kenya, Tanzania, those kind of countries. But then there's the Arab that eventually invaded Egypt was the one from the north, further north. So the countries in the south are countries like Yemen, Oman, and so on. So they start to think, okay, we need to start learning how to be boat people, okay? Because if we can control these silk routes and everything like that, then we start to make more money. And this is what allows them eventually to go into Spain and Portugal in about the year 711, okay? And this is where the Moorish period of Europe kind of begins, okay? the Moorish occupation, the black occupation of Europe at this point. Right. So these northern Arabs eventually part of what they call the Umayyad dynasty under Umar the Great. The Umayyad dynasty is essentially the dynasty that is controlling the trade, but also this North African empire that they now got. In fact, they went so far. This is how like gung-ho these guys were. They went as far as so if you let me show you a map. Let me show you a map. It's a lot easier to see on a map. Do I have a map? Here we go. So here's a map. So they went all the way west to Morocco. Morocco, of course, is the beginning of the Atlantic, at least that part of the Atlantic. If there was any more land, they would have continued. But of course, everything to the it was just water, and to the south of them was the Sahara Desert, and then eventually sub-Saharan Africa. So as far as they were concerned, that was all they could do for the time being. But where was I? But they still felt as though they were able to do more. And if you read the book, The Golden Age of the Moors, by, what's the guy's name? E.W. Boville. E.W. Boville. It talks about how these people were so, they were so all about conquering. They really wanted to conquer. But now they started to think, okay, you know what? Let's see what's south. Now, the reason why they even go south into the Sahara is because of the camel. Okay, the Romans had introduced the camel. This is what they called the dromedarian camel. That's the humpback camel, the common camel that you see in that part of West Africa or North Africa. It's not the kind that you see in South America. It's the humpback camel, which obviously meant that longer journeys could happen. The Romans couldn't do it, of course, because that's not what they're used to. But when the Arabs came in through Islam, they said, okay, let's start going to do trade. So like I said, they conquered Northern Africa through conquest, no doubt. But as they're coming south through the Sahara into sub-Saharan Africa, they are not doing it for the purpose of conquest. It's for trade, right? They've heard about gold in these places. Okay, this is pre-Mansa Musa. We're talking of the time of ancient Ghana, or what they call ancient Ghana, which was really ancient Wagadu. Okay, so how did they know about this? This book, Herodotus, by Herodotus, Histories, he talks about the Garamantes. These are essentially a group of black people. Him and the troglodytes, they basically show connections between the peripheral of the desert. So imagine the northern part of the Sahara Desert that links to Northern Africa, and people south of it. Okay, so they're starting to. So he's made mention. So people are aware that this is happening. So they use the camels to go south and trade, and this obviously created several trade routes. Trade routes, which, by the way, if you look at the migrant crisis that's going on now with Africans leaving West Africa from like the corner of Senegal, all the way from Sudan. Even the UFC fighter, Francis Ngannou, the Cameroonian guy, he came through one of those routes. Many people come through one of those routes. Those same routes are used even today. So these Arabs essentially established these routes into various parts of West Africa. So like places like Timbuktu in Mali, which, if you should watch my documentary, The Rise of Islam in Mali, I essentially take a journey to Timbuktu so you can see what it's like even today. Very multicultural, trade desert border city or trade city. So places like Kano, if you've seen my documentary about Kano, Djenné, if you see my documentary Djenné and the Dogon, I go to Djenné. These are all the major trading cities on the periphery of the desert in the Africa side. So they start establishing all these trade routes. So this is why I say travel is so important. You have to go and see these places for yourself. When, of course, it's safe, by the way. I'm not saying go now. Okay. So they eventually start to penetrate. Now, when they get there, we're talking about the Empire of Wagadu, or ancient Ghana. Do I have a map? I think I have a map of it somewhere. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This is from my documentary, actually. This is a map that we kind of recreated. Okay, so the Sahara Desert is all there. So So the Wagadu Empire kind of covers various regions, covers Mali, covers Mauritania, and yeah, so that's the region. Now that place is called the Gold Land. In fact, the king is called the King of Gold. His name is the Kaya Magan. Again, watch my documentary, The Rise of Islam in Mali, on the channel, and you'll be able to understand a bit more about that kingdom. So these people, when they get there, the Arabs are like, wow, they open their eyes, they're like seeing all this stuff, like, wow, this stuff is amazing. And of course, they have some contempt for the Africans because like these people, they believe in all sorts of like pagan gods or whatever. You know what how they associate us. They're not monotheists like us. They don't believe in one God. And then likewise, the Africans are like, these people are doing whatever, you know, like but there was the one thing that took them was that every time they would be praying, every time it was a call to prayer, every time it was time for prayer, these people would drop whatever they were doing and go and pray. So these African kings, the Kaya Magans and the nobility of Wagadu, they're thinking to themselves, man, these people are really dedicated to their religion. But also they're thinking to themselves that, man, these people are coming in and bringing all these incredible looking things. And obviously we're making a lot of money back or wealth back from them because of the trade of our gold. So the kings of Wagadu are thinking to themselves, or ancient Ghana, are thinking to themselves, man, we could probably associate ourselves with these guys. It seems like this religion is a very important thing for them, right? So whilst Wagadu wasn't whilst Wagadu wasn't an Islamic place, the nobility started to convert to Islam for I guess you can call it for self-interest. But they didn't make their people turn to Islam. That just shows you, and that's a political thing, which also happened, if you know the story of Queen Nzinga of Angola, who centuries later, who converted to Christianity for the sake of dealing with the Portuguese. You know, like so there are people that do these things for political reasons. It happens all the time, certainly through history. So they and also what's significant is they kept they never intermingled in that sense with the Arabs unless they were trading. So the Arabs that would come into places like Wagadu, they would give them a town. You know, this is where we get the concept of like twin towns. So like, for instance, you hit this Chinatown, whatever, Italy, I don't know, what other towns do we have? But, you know, the concept of like things like Chinatown come from this period because they kept these people 8 kilometers away from town, in their own community where they can eat whatever they wanted. They never really intermingled with the Africans, right? So if in fact they in the ruins of Kumbi Saleh, which is the capital of Wagadu, which is over here, Kumbi Saleh is just there, you could see it. They found 8 kilometers away in the settlement that was there for the Arabs, they found that there was a garlic, which is obviously part of their diet. Okay, so it comes into this part and it's dispersed through Jenne and all these different places. And I think rather than, oh, what's the time? Rather than going on, I don't know if I can continue. First of all, guys, let me just get a few shouts. Are we understanding what's going on here? Am I talking too fast, too slow? Because this is quite an important bit of history, and I want to know whether I should go on. It's quite late where I am now. How are we all doing? Are people on this? People getting what's going on? Okay, let me see what some of you guys are saying. All right, let me read some of your chats actually before while you're giving me your comments. Okay, it's all the same slave trade. Michael Daniels, it's all the same slave trade. Absolutely. Yes, it is. Zainab Badawi spoke of this. Zainab Badawi spoke of this during her History of Africa docuseries. You know, I've never seen that docuseries, and I know it's on YouTube, but for some reason I never have the energy to fully watch the whole series. Yes, the peace treaty between Egypt and Christian Sudan. Yes, absolutely. And then last one. The history of the Arabians and slavery is rarely discussed. Thank you for the history lesson. You're very welcome. Okay, let me just continue briefly because I think it's possible. I'm going a little bit slow here, but let me just keep going. All right. So now, the kings of Wagadu, the nobility in Wagadu, convert to Islam for business reasons, if you will. The Kaya Magan, King of Gold, this his title. He has a vested interest in the trade. but he doesn't force his people to convert to Islam. And it's interesting because, you know, in most places, it's like the people who are really suffering, in most places in the world, the people who are really suffering are the ones that take to like foreign religions and foreign theories and concepts faster than the nobility. They always want to keep the status quo. But of course, these people, it just shows you how free the society was. People were able to think and do. And again, you have to watch my documentary, Jenny and the Dogon and Rise of Islam in Mali, so that you can understand exactly how their kingdoms were structured. These were not people who were despotic leaders like we have in Europe. You know, these are people who really were fair and so on. Now, as part of the trade, there was also some slavery. When I say some slavery, there was a lot of slavery. Again, Africans are not looking at slavery through the lens of a European in the year 1760. They don't see slavery as a perpetual thing, meaning your grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren will also be slaves. They're looking at it from the point of view of these are the people that we can give you in exchange for something, because this was a common thing that was going on around the world at the time. Now, so let's deal with the actual slavery patterns that existed. Do I have a map? Do I have a map? Okay, so these are those routes that I was trying to show you, by the way. These are the Trans-Saharan trade routes, okay? And it kind of shows you this, again, these are some of the images I found on Google. These are not the best images, but they'll kind of give you an idea. They'll kind of give you an idea of what people got. Salt was obviously a major thing in later Mali, but specifically in Wagadu as well. But also they were taking enslaved people. Now, the Trans-Saharan route is critical in understanding, okay? It takes you into places like Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. It's like 600-700 miles of the worst desert you can see. So you imagine African people shackled in caravans. You know, a journey would take like, you know, a month and a half, 45 days in that heat. Can you imagine if there's any miscalculation of like water supplies? Can you imagine if they just like, oh, there's supposed to be a well there, or you know, we turned left at the wrong place, you know, because it's not as if there's signs or sat nav, you know. So just imagine how many times people were stuck there and died, just like the migrant story that exists now. Those people coming from West Africa trying to get to Europe, they get stuck in the desert, maybe the car breaks down and so on. Imagine at that time shackled. So if a mother is sick and is dying, they leave her there with her baby crying. You know, so it was still brutal. It was still brutal. Make no mistake, this was worse than what they call the Middle Passage, when enslaved Africans were being put on boats. Believe me, it's very hard to comprehend, but this has to be worse. Worse. The scorching heat by day and the freezing cold at night. Shackled, no water, dehydration, all these different things. Okay. Now, what were they actually using these? They were essentially bringing these enslaved people. Again, it's not the same slavery as in Americas. They were using them to come and, you know, they were raiding them. There was all some from warfare, some were being kidnapped. In fact, the story of Roots, the new remake of it, they set it like that he was going to Timbuktu, that he was kidnapped. This is the Kunta Kinte character. So they would march them through sub-Sahara, through the Sahara, excuse me, and then take them to these awful places. Okay, so it's pretty gruesome experience. Now, so that's the Trans-Saharan route. Now, when they get to the major cities like Cairo and so on, they would go through either the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean trade routes. This is also significant when you're trying to understand what these people were used for. And I'll deal with a couple of them very, very quickly. Now, the rest, and it's also important to understand the Red Sea route into Arabia is really only stopped in 1900. Okay, the year 1900 is when it really stopped. So it's not as if these things, you know, people were like, oh, you know, let's slow it down, you know, the abolition of slavery. Because essentially the concept of an enslaved person is consistent now in the Arab world as it was 500 years ago. It's the same sort of thing to them anyway. But let's not talk about that right now. So then you have the slavery that was taken into the Indian Ocean, and then eventually the Arab Peninsula. So places like Zanzibar, Kilwa. Let me just show you Zanzibar, Kilwa. If you look on the east coast of Africa, there, Zanzibar, which is a big holiday destination right now. Kilwa, right next to right on the coast. These are places where they would take them from and take them into this part of the world. And it backfired in many cases. And of course, there were rebellions. I'm sure some people know about some of them. But let me move on. I want to talk about slavery under the Arabs, okay? Because the question always comes down to this. And I always like to emphasize this. There's no slavery that's good. Once you take somebody's freedom, it's not good. But there are levels. There are levels. And I don't want to try and make it seem like there's something good about being enslaved, but there's a way that they were treated in Africa versus the way they were treated once they left. And that's just a fact, okay? So essentially, you have these brokers of slavery, Damascus, Baghdad, and largely you have these Jewish merchants who is essentially the people that are funding the boats that are able to move across, Jews from Lisbon, from Amsterdam, Cadiz, Toulouse, Marseille, these places in France. These are the Jews that control these areas, even Bristol in England. These are the people that essentially funded this slave trade, right? Essentially. So these were the great like merchants of their time. They were the brokers. They were the ones who would sell them on to different places and so on. In Arabia, Africans were also used for domestic. They were probably more so than they were in the Americas. In the Americas, it was, or United States of America specifically, it's more of a plantation thing, plantation slavery, some domestics. But over there, there was a lot of it that were used as domestics. Okay, and I want to show you this image because you have to understand that slavery under the Arabs, on the surface, was not as bad. You know, they would take men, for example, and make them part of the army. But they were mindful that they didn't want them to interbreed with the women. So they would make the men eunuchs, you know, essentially castrate them, take their balls, basically stop them from being able to reproduce, which is horrible. And that's what this image, what I'm trying to show you with this image, okay? But these men will eventually be asked to guard the harem. They would be protectors of the kings, the caliphs, and so on. They would be part of the army, which is a very strange concept. You give somebody a weapon after enslaving them, but this is what they were doing. But many of them were actually used for mining. They were used for mining and plantation work as well. Okay, there were plantations, and there was a lot of mining in horrible conditions. And like I said, there was a period when it backfired, and I'm going to deal with that in a second. In fact, I would say more, just if you look at Marcus Garvey Jr.'s assessment of Marcus Garvey's son, he's also a historian. His assessment of this is that probably more so, they were more used for plantations than they were in the Americas. Keep in mind, right, the slavery that existed in the Americas is remember, mostly they're going to the Caribbean first. Only a small percentage of the enslaved Africans went to the United States of America. Obviously, you look at the population. That's why Brazil has more Africans than any other country outside of Africa, right? Because they were taking them to South America, they were taking them to the Caribbean. This is where the bulk of the populations were going. America had a very small portion, okay? So that's another thing that I think we need to try and talk about another day. But they were used as domestic workers, plantation workers, miners, but also but the women too were intermarried. So some of the women were brought as part of the harem. In other words, they could breed with the sheikhs or the kings. They could breed with nobility. It was okay. It wasn't. They could even be married to them. So it wasn't. Again, that never happened in the Americas, but it happened here. Okay, so that's a difference. But it did backfire at times. And the biggest one of all was the Zanj rebellion. So the Zanj rebellion takes place in what is now called Iraq. And I want you to look at the map on the right. The map on the right, in the far right corner, I guess, top, sort of like in the middle on the top, you'll see where Basra is in Iraq. That's roughly where these people, where the Zanj rebellion took place. Now, where did the Zanj people come from? You see, this isn't like some type of indigenous Arabic word. It's just a word that describes these black people. So if you look to the map on the left, it shows kind of red area. This is what, in the Arabic context, they said this is where the Zanj come from. So southeastern part of Africa. So your top left is about Congo, Congo Brazzaville rather, and then going all the way down to the bottom right through the Swahili coast, Tanzania, all the way down to what is now, I guess, South Africa. Okay, they grouped all that as Zanj people. So these are people that they were being taken. And if I just take you back to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes, you can see how that's possible. So these are the people that were brought in to be used as part of the Indian slave trade. And again, I talked about what's his name, Malik Ambar, who's another one of these Africans that's taken to India, rises to the to a top rank in the I think it's the Mughal Empire of India, or what is now India anyway. All right, so just so you know, just so you can see it, let me just show it to you again. So these people, the Zanj are the baddest people on the planet. So these are the precursors to the Haitian Revolution. So we're talking about the year 869 AD. So 200 plus years after Muhammad is dead and Egypt is invaded. So this is happening over time. In fact, a very good book you can read is Black Africans in the Islamic World by Hunwick. Hunwick is his name. Black Africans in the Islamic World. Make sure you read it. So these are essentially people from the Swahili coast, Kenya, Tanzania, who were used them to drain salt marshes. So you can imagine they want to, if you look at let me show you the map again. So you look at the two rivers that are there in that area. You have to look very closely. The Tigris and the Euphrates. Those are the two rivers that are there, very famous rivers. So they used to drain the marshland over there in order for salt to have salt production. Okay, the climate is right for salt production in that part of the world. And the conditions are so terrible. It's, they were also used for, they actually used them actually for sugar cultivation as well, right? So there was actually plantations there, sugar plantations there as well. But the conditions were so bad, okay? And just like the Haitian Empire, they made a big mistake. Because Haitian Revolution, not Haitian Empire, Haitian Revolution, the big mistake they made is they brought people from the same part of the world, mostly Dahomey and all these places, people who were fighters, like the best fighters in their land. Similarly with the Zanj, they brought people from the same place who spoke the same language, fought the same sorts of fights. They were new imports of enslaved people, which is always a big mistake. It's always a big mistake. You see, in the Arabic slave trade, the whip was used just to break people, because it wasn't like, in America, you'd be whipped very often because there was a feeling that you have to work from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, right? So this whipping is a constant thing just to remind you that you need to keep working. Whereas over there, once you're whipped, the first time you kind of get it. But once you're put on in these horrible conditions to work in these plantations and in these salt marshes, then it becomes horrible. Now, these people can communicate with each other in their language, and all hell breaks loose. Okay, so this happened around a year before. So 868, they bring this new import of enslaved people, and initially they rebel. It's a successful rebellion initially. Okay, what makes it even more successful, and this is another inspiring story, is the guards. Remember, they made some Africans who were there previously eunuchs after they'd been, they take their ability to reproduce. They were at first fighting on the side of the caliphs, but eventually left the caliph and went and joined these people. So this rebellion was successful for a long time. They established their own capital. They even took Basra. Now, if any of you watched the Iraq War, Basra is one of those places they talk about all the time. So it's another interesting thing to think about, that as the US was invading there, those black troops didn't even know, those black troops that were fighting for the US didn't even know that their ancestors had rebelled against enslavement in this particular place called Basra. This is another inspiring coincidences of history. And this is why travel and study are crucial. Okay. You have to travel and study. So these people are able to, in fact, they go even as far as Baghdad. So think about it again. They're going as far as Baghdad. So you just imagine when Saddam Hussein's statue fell, and everybody felt, oh my God, we've been liberated. Centuries before that, nearly over 1,000 years before that, our ancestors were going to take Baghdad for themselves because they were forcefully put there. Another inspiring story. So anyway, unfortunately, it didn't work out. But it took like 3 years for them to be defeated in the first place. Okay. And actually, after that, the Arabs never used Africans for plantation slavery again. Okay. They learned their lesson. The VZ rebellion and Prosser and the various rebellions, they didn't really learn their lesson. They understood that, because that was the basis of the business of enslavement in the Americas. It's for plantations. But these Arabs were like, look, we could use them somewhere else. And also, they made they managed to figure out alternative ways. The Portuguese obviously made this mistake as well in Brazil. They also, instead of just stopping when they had their first few rebellions, they kept doing it, and of course it backfired. And you see how Brazil eventually turned out. So essentially, that was the inspiring part, that Africans were also rebelling, and there are a few more stories. It's just that the Zanj rebellion is one of the most popular ones, one of the most famous ones. It's essentially the Haitian Revolution of the Middle Ages. So the Arab slave trade essentially is 1,000+ slave trade, 1,000-year+ slave trade. So if the slave trade started in 1450s with the Europeans, it started 700, 800 years before that. Okay, so we're talking about over 1,000 years. We're talking really about 1,200 years ago. Okay, so this is something that was really, really powerful and had various different roots. And these connections that were established by Islamic conquerors, the Islamic Empire of North Africa into the Middle East, and all their connections into Europe, these various things were what made it function more. But of course, they didn't keep records like they did, like the Europeans did. So there's no way to account for how many people lost their lives, how many people died, how many people were taken, and so on. It's a very different form of business. In Timbuktu, in the old manuscripts, and Jenne, there are people that kept records. But I don't know if you know, there's been a Ansar Dine, which is I guess they're like the Boko Haram, like what could I call them? Like the Al Qaeda kind of Mali. When they occupied Timbuktu about 10 years ago, they had this like thing about trying to destroy all these old manuscripts that are 1,000 years old. I was fortunate to see a lot of them. In fact, you can see, if you watch my documentary, again, plug, Jenne and the Dogon Rise of Islam in Mali, you could see me going through some of these old manuscripts where they kept records and things like that. So there's no way of knowing how many people died. Of course, if like I said, if a mother is dying in the Sahara Desert, they leave her there. The vultures will consume her eventually, and they leave her with her baby. So it's a very, very harsh reality. But Arabs obviously stopped becoming a major player in slave trade. Why? And I think that has to be the easiest bit, has to do with the fact that they eventually colonized Europe. You see, they colonized Europe, Spain, and Portugal. So we're talking, look at the right side. This is the best map I could find, by the way. There's none that really kind of emphasized what I wanted to emphasize. So obviously the Islamic and Arabic empire took Egypt in the 600s, right? So it wasn't until the 1440s that the Arabic monopoly on the Mediterranean started dying. But just so you know, at the time, Arabic is so important to the world. It's the main language spoken. In the same way that you have English as the most important language, the main language spoken, Arabic was the language spoken. In fact, a lot of the things that we have in like mathematics, algebra is an Arabic word. You know, the various things that we use today come from the Arabic language, because the Arabs conquered essentially all the parts of the world that mattered. It's no different to say if America and Britain were all of a sudden conquered by a particular place. Those are two of the most influential places. And so if they were conquered, the rest of the world would disseminate that culture, the culture of that particular place that conquered them. So, the Arabic is no more Latin or Greek, it's Arabic. Arabic is the main language for trade, it's the main language for business, even for warfare. But particularly when you talk about Portugal, there's a prince called Henry the Navigator. He essentially, as he's taken advantage of the fact that the Moorish, or rather the Islamic, and the Moors are essentially black people, but also a large contingent of them are also Arabic, who occupied southern Spain, occupied Spain, Portugal, and southern France. These people are in control of this part of the world, but they're dying. They're being defeated because Europe is essentially rising up. This is an 800-year colonization, by the way, or 700-year colonization. They come into Spain in 711 and 1440s, so nearly 1,000 years. This is what they call the Dark Ages. And they call it the Dark Ages, obviously, because it's dark people that control them. So this is the part of history that people don't really talk about. They call it the Renaissance period, okay? They're starting to wane, obviously. So Henry the Navigator takes advantage, and he recognizes this whole thing about trade and the sea. And he goes and says, okay, we need to try and get the best, smartest naval people around the world. Let's bring them together, almost like the way NASA brings people together, right? And the best minds. And they said, we need to figure out a way to be able to sail the world and control these routes, right? So so Henry the Navigator creates this naval academy, and they establish their own unique brand of boat called the caravel, which is able to manipulate the wind. If you remember, I don't know if it's last week I talked about, but I also talk about this in my documentary, Rise of Islam in Mali, about the currents that take you to different parts of the world, right? When I say currents, wind currents, that if you put a ship there with no sail, it will direct you to a certain part of the world. So they obviously learned this information. Christopher Columbus learned this information coming to the west coast of Africa and so on. So they learned about how to get to different parts of the world. But with this, their caravel, they were able to get past a place called Cape Bojador. Cape Bojador is basically Morocco, what is now Morocco. Let me see if that picture's there. Can you see it? No. So if you look at where Lisbon is, no, you can't see it. You can't see it. So Cape Bojador is basically in Morocco, so the far western, northwestern part of Africa. That's as far as they could go. But with this caravel and with all the technology they were able to do, using Bartholomew Diaz and Vasco da Gama, we know Vasco da Gama, they were able to not only penetrate into past sub-Saharan Africa into what was called the Guinea Coast, which is where we start to see them coming and taking Elmina and Cape Coast, these places on the West African coast, the Guinea Coast where Dahomey is, which I talked about last couple of weeks. This is why they were able to start coming to that place in the first place, before Britain, before everybody else. And if you look at Portugal's proximity to Africa compared to Britain, you could see why they were aware. Plus, they were also colonized by Moors and people that came from that part of the world. Okay, so just so you could see. Now, the most significant thing that they did that was essentially like that period's walking on the moon was Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz were able to circumnavigate what they call the Cape of Good Hope towards East Africa and India. So if you look at this image again, look at where Portugal is. So we're looking on the far right side. You see where it says Portugal and Lisbon. They were able to circumnavigate and go into India. This changed, make no mistake, this changed the game. This changed the game. This is essentially what changed the world that we have today. Because if they weren't able to do that, the awareness that they had to the west coast of Africa wouldn't have been alerted. They wouldn't have alerted the other parts of Europe, the Dutch, the British, the Norwegians, and so on. Because this technology was unique to this part of the world. It's not as if the information was being passed over as quickly as we have information being passed now through the internet. It took, to get from Portugal to Britain, if they even had something to deal with each other, could take months. So this information, once they were able to circumnavigate, they knew that now we can get round. We don't necessarily need the Mediterranean anymore. Plus, we are now hearing from these Africans that there's a land in the Americas. And of course, this is when they were able to go and explore the Americas in the first place. Christopher Columbus, of course, had his voyages, I think 3 or 4 voyages that he had in total. Okay, so this achievement, this was a significant achievement in world history. It broke the Muslim monopoly of world trade, because now they could bypass the Muslim the Muslim stronghold that was there in the Mediterranean and go straight for all the spices they wanted in India. They could go and even start trying to get the silk from China. So the Mediterranean was no longer that highway anymore. It wasn't dominated by the Arabs anymore. And gradually, the Portuguese under Henry the Navigator were able to kick them off. And that's how we eventually lead to the transatlantic slave trade. Because last couple of weeks, I talked about the Portuguese. I just wanted to set the tone to understand how the Portuguese come into it. Of course, the Arabs still continue their Trans-Saharan trade, but they start to do deals with the Portuguese. And instead of taking them directly across the Sahara, at least in the big numbers that they were doing before, they start to bring them down to the west coast of Africa. And that's how you see enslaved Africans from West Africa going specifically to the Americas rather than going to Arabia. Okay. And it's ironic. I'll just say this in conclusion. It's just so ironic in the same way, in the same order that these Europeans came into Africa. You can see these countries are declining. Portugal is, without shadow of a doubt, in Western Europe. If you read the words of Amilcar Cabral, they're essentially the sick men of Europe. They are the most backward. They're the most dysfunctional. But they were the ones who, in the 1400s, were the pioneers of this whole thing that we call slave trade, the main business of the world. The same way that now we're in an intellectual world or a tech world. That was the tech of the time, Greece came into Africa before everybody else. Greece, 332 BC. We're talking about 2,300 years ago. Greece is right at the bottom. They had to be bailed out from the EU 100 times because they couldn't manage their things. Even Italy, to an extent. Rome is obviously where Italy is. And Rome came in after the Greeks. Look at how it is now. So it's interesting how things are happening. And I think if you follow cycles, you will see that, Britain will eventually collapse. Collapse in the sense that it would no longer be a major power. And certainly, if you look at 1940, if you ask the British person in 1940, Britain had a quarter of the world, and now they don't. So you can already see how things are starting to change. So I'm sure, if anything, I want to show that there's some optimism in this story, that if you can see how everybody came in, the Arabs, who were the last to come in, essentially, if you will, they are now getting their shine, but they're also, parts of it are also slightly in decline. But theirs is a very recent thing. And I think regardless of how you want to look at their slave trade, it's still a slave trade, but their whole system is not shutting down. If anything, I think we are the closest people that can work with them as African people. But I think we have to understand the cultural background, that no one in history has been our friend. No one has been our friend. Everybody has exploited us. Why are they going to Makuria, to the new Christian Nubia, and telling them, okay, look, rather than go to war, give us slaves? I mean, it's just silly. you know, this demand keeps being created because people understand the uniqueness of African people working the land. There's a strength that we have that we can endure beyond any other person. Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I'm surprised I did that in one. I thought I'd do that in two, and I'm sure I missed some stuff out. But you know, I just wanted to just explain that background so that you can see how Africa is the way it is. I think another day might be worthwhile to understand Islam in Africa and how Islam actually works in Africa, and then also understand how the Africans left parts of West Africa, joined the Arabs, and went into Spain. Because that's also crucial. These are things that happen in the world that if you isolate them to one small region, you will miss the whole point. You miss the significance of it, but also you'll miss where we're in a world where we just want to find, there just has to be one person to blame. But the reality is there's a lot of blame to go around, but also there's context to understanding where that blame comes from. So yeah, so that's me. Any questions? Anybody have any questions? Appreciate you guys for sticking through. I know that wasn't the easiest thing to do, but I really appreciate it. All right, comments we got. Guys, please, I need the like button to be liked. If you like this, if you watched it, if you're still there, please make sure you like. Please check out those two documentaries of mine, The Rise of Islam in Mali and Jene and the Dogon, because I go into more detail about both. Please check them out. I've put them in the description. So all you have to do is just click when you're done, when you have time. And, you know, we're all good. But I want to thank you all for tuning in. If there are no questions, I'm going to bounce because it's late where I am. I need to get to bed. So thank you. I'm going to play my music out. And here we go. By the way, my music this is the music I like to listen to, even in my own personal time. Tumani Diabate and so on. Anyway, thank you very much, people. Blessings, peace, and love. Have a good night.